Hello everybody, my name is Paulina. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're gonna go through building a simple Pomodoro timer. In the age of AI, I feel it's very easy to like totally vibe code something, but actually typing it out by hand is an exercise that I've always wanted to go deeper on to just better understand what the code is actually doing. So today we're gonna still use different tools like Claude to help us, but the actual end products we're going to code ourselves in VS Code. My goal with this video is just to give a really simple overview of how to build a Pomodoro timer using HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And just as a disclaimer, this is my first time doing this. I have taken some basic coding classes before, but I'm a consultant by background, so coding is not where I spend most of my time. But I thought it would be fun to just go over this and do it in a fun, exciting way. So let's get into it. For this video, I am going to split up my workflow into 3 different phases: plan, design, and then build. In terms of tools for this video, I used Pinterest, Procreate, Figma, VS Code, GitHub, and Vercel. All right, so the first thing that I did was just write out a simple product requirements document, a PRD, basically just writing out what exactly I wanted this web application to do. I wrote out that I wanted completed focus sessions to grow an elegant garden. I wanted these focus sessions to be 25 minutes each, and I wrote out some like really particular flowers that I've been loving, like calla lilies, white roses, and meadow blooms. My goals were to make this a working deployed application with a basic footprint, no crazy backend. I mean, I'm going to use Vercel and GitHub just to host my data and then to actually host the application, but I didn't want it to be anything crazy. I wanted it to be visually beautiful. To be completely honest, it's not exactly what I was hoping for it to be. This is a learning experience, and in the next video, we can make it even prettier. In terms of non-goals, I didn't want to focus too much on having like any sort of accounts or any crazy settings beyond like pausing and starting and like resetting. I wrote out a simple MVP scope, so by default each one of the focus sessions was going to be 25 minutes with a 5-minute break, and then also have a long break of 15 minutes every 4 completed focus sessions. So again, these are just parameters that are helpful to write out later when we're actually doing the simple code, and that was kind of my goal. In terms of what the actual garden would look like, so each completed focus session would add 1 flower to the garden, and these actual flowers I drew in Procreate using a pixel brush, and I'll show you guys. You guys can use them yourselves. I also uploaded these images onto GitHub, so you can just like download them and use them. In terms of my first step, I wanted to focus first on planning. So I was just getting some inspiration for just like a botanical color palette, something that felt like elegant and mature, but also still fun and pink and whimsical. Browns with pinks and greens. So that was the vibe that I was looking for. I spent a while just like rummaging through different things on Pinterest, and then also on just like different color palette generators. Once I actually picked out my colors, I actually just wrote out the hex code for exactly which colors I wanted to use. Again, like this isn't that important, but if you're looking for a certain feel for your application, you kind of want to be consistent in the colors that you want to use. So that's exactly what I did. I used like a hex color picker to actually copy down what is that hex code, and then I can actually use those numbers to write out like different text that I have either in this video or in the application, so that I have a consistent view across the board. Then I went ahead and started to get some inspiration for the kind of images, like the kind of pixelated flowers that I wanted to actually grow every time a user completed a focus session. So I have been loving calla lilies, so I added some of those to my pin board. I've also been loving this flower called chocolate lace. I came across it because I'm in the middle of wedding planning, and I just thought this was the coolest flower in the world. I had never heard of it, or I just didn't know the name of it, but it is super cute. And there's a similar flower called Queen Anne's lace that I'm also obsessed with. So I was just gathering some inspiration to make the application look really cute. And I was also just looking through some roses. And then once I got an idea of what the flowers would actually look like is when I just added these all to a folder to make a mental model of like, okay, this is exactly what I want to draw in Procreate, and here's just some inspiration. Because we're the girlies, like we just need to get inspired. The next thing that I did, and this is totally an optional step, I just felt like it helped me make a better brain model of what exactly I was doing. I went into Figma and I actually wrote out like what are the 3 types of files that I'm going to be using and making to actually code my web application. So I determined that I needed an index.html file that actually just builds like the initial structure of the page. So like the boxes, the text, but without actually clicking the buttons, like it's not gonna do anything. And then also I wrote out, okay, I need a style.css file. So CSS is just used for like examples, font sizes or font colors or bolding or spacing. So the CSS just basically makes the web app look pretty. And then finally, the script.js actually holds the logic and the functionality. So if we're doing some calculations when we're doing our countdown from our timer, or if we're doing any sort of like changing of modes, whether you're in like a focus mode or in your break mode, all of that like logic, all of those actions are actually going to happen in the script.js file. So that's what I'm aiming to show, just like keeping it very simple. Again, I am not an expert. This just helped me better understand exactly what I was doing and why I was doing it, because I just feel like if I were to just put this in Claude code, like it would totally do it for me. And I did use it, to be clear, to write out parts of my like code, and you'll see that later on in the video. But it was just helpful to understand like deeply what am I doing and why. The HTML is just the overall structure. The CSS maybe in colors, shapes, padding makes it look pretty. And then the JavaScript is actually doing the counting, doing calculations, identifying what mode we're in. Then I went a step further and I started to add some post-its for what I was looking to do. And this is more so, again, just like to give you a mental model of like what our code is actually going to do in the future, just on sticky notes. So for example, one of the things that I knew that we needed to do is to add a timer box. And we can do this by creating like a separate section with a divider that says, okay, this is where we're going to display the time. We also want an area in the HTML that's going to say, okay, what mode are we in? Are we in a focus or are we in a break? And we can do that in HTML by using like an idea called like mode label. Then I also know that in HTML, we're going to need these 3 different buttons. We're going to need start, reset, and pause. And we need to have an ID encoded in each one of these parts of the HTML so that JavaScript can actually find like, oh, well, I'm looking for the start button and I'm going to execute this action when I find this start button. And that's exactly what it's doing here. I also started to add in some emojis because the girls literally just have to have fun. We can't just do this without some emojis, some flowers. Like, that's just not me. All right, when it came to the actual like garden box where I knew that I was gonna have these like pixel flower images pop up, I knew that I needed to just have a section that would house all of these flowers. So for starters, we determined, okay, like we actually should just have an empty container that is denoted by some sort of like divider ID. So like, let's just call it the garden box. And eventually when we add in the flowers, we're actually going to use the JavaScript to plant flowers, and they're going to be located in this garden box. One of the things that I also wanted to try is I feel like I've seen a lot of Pomodoro timers that use like this circle image, and I just wanted to keep it spicy, do something a little bit different. So I knew that I wanted it to be an oval. I wanted it to have like a fixed height and width and radius, and also I did this in Claude because I had no idea what the measurements are. So take it with a grain of salt and just see how it looks on the page when you actually render it using the live server that you can actually spin up to see what your code is doing. And again, I'll show you how to do all of this in VS Code. I also knew that I wanted it to be like centered. I knew that I wanted to use the color palette that I wrote out in my PRD. So all of that is just what I'm writing out here. I knew that I wanted each of the buttons to have like an olive or like a soft brown background. And I wanted it to have white text so that it would be easily readable. And I also wanted to have like a hover state so that if you roll over onto that like start, reset, or stop button, you actually get like a slightly different color because you're actually going forward and like hovering over that button. So again, all of this is like stuff when you're on Instagram, you are completely blind to because you just don't realize that it's happening because it happens so seamlessly. Trying to understand all of these features and like how it's working was a pretty cool exercise. And then finally, I also just wrote up some of the specifications for what I wanted in terms of my garden container, like that I wanted it to be at the bottom of the page. I want a gap between the flowers because otherwise they might have been like stacked on top of each other or right next to each other. Like you really have to specify all of these dimensions in your code. So again, this is just like a good practice, and this is stuff that I learned as I was just going through this exercise. So before I actually wrote out everything that was going into my JavaScript, which is the most complicated one because it's all of the actions, I wanted to actually give you a preview of how I started to build this in VS Code. So VS Code stands for Virtual Code Studio. It's an environment where you can just test different types of files, and I've used it for very basic coding. So instead of just opening up your terminal, this is a more simple way to write out code to test it. And there's a lot of really cool extensions and like add-ons. Like you can use Claude right in your Virtual Code Studio. You can use Codex, which is OpenAI's coding tool. Then I went ahead and just started to make a directory for my project. So for my project, at least I had a folder on my computer that just pertained to this rosy garden. And then there's also another command that starts with a CD, and it basically is used to change directories just to make sure that you're operating in the right one when you actually start to build out your code. Then I'm just actually creating that index HTML file. So it's pretty easy. Like all you do is you literally just hit new file, and then you start to type in exactly what you need to do. I also just started to write out some of the broad-based code. This meta-charset UTF-8 is just a fancy way of telling the browser, okay, which alphabet to use so that you don't get any weird symbols and you're just using like the alphabet and numbers and emojis and you don't get any weird characters. Next came down to creating that style.css file. So I actually just took the colors that I had listed out in my PRD and I just copied them in because I wanted to be able to reference them in the remainder of my file. And VS Code is awesome because it catches when you are using the wrong syntax. So syntax meaning the wrong typing of characters, and you're including, like if you have to include a semicolon at the end, it'll catch if you're missing it. I defined those at the top, and then I referred back to the colors as variables just when I needed to use them again. Then I just wrote out like some ideas for spacing and margin and padding. Again, this is an area where I use Claude just to help me figure out what does the spacing actually need to look like, and it was pretty helpful. At this point, I got kind of antsy and I wanted to see what the application looked like so far. So I actually used an extension that I found online called Live Server to launch a local development server. So I actually just started up my code so that I could see it in a live server. So that's exactly what you see on the right-hand side of the screen. The next thing that I did is I actually took the mental images that I had in my head for these flowers and I actually drew them on Procreate. I just spent some time drawing these out. I used a pixel brush, and then when I actually ended up drawing these out, I realized that I made them way too small, and I was like, how the heck do I even fix this? And to be clear, I still don't totally understand how I fixed this, but what I did is I just took these images and I put them into Claude and I said, hey, can you scale these up? I think the most important thing is that if you make them in an 8x8 type format, if you just scale them up on the exact, so you scale them up like 8 times, Claude is just able to help you make these images bigger. So that's exactly what I did. And then I was kind of stumped on like, how do I actually put these into my code so that they actually show up and I can refer back to them? So here I'm just talking to Claude, figuring out, okay, exactly how do I need to like define these in an HTML, which you do, and then you can call those images later. So that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm just getting a better idea of like, okay, what do I need to do to actually show this? The next thing I did, and we're just going to spend some time on this, is I wrote out exactly what I wanted the JavaScript to do. So again, this step is like totally optional. I just felt like it was helpful for me to get a frame of reference of like, okay, what am I actually doing and why? So I specifically wrote out, okay, like first you click something, then something runs in the background, maybe some memory updates, and then the screen actually changes. So that was just helpful for me to get a better understanding of like what is actually happening and why. So first I was clear that there are certain settings and fixed numbers that wouldn't change throughout the course of my application. There is focus time, which is the 25 minutes, probably need to store it as seconds. I mean, maybe you don't know. That was like totally something that I like guessed on. Then I know that we have a short break and a long break. And then I also know that there is those fixed flower images that we referred back to in our HTML file that we'll probably need to call from our script.js file. Then there are certain values that get updated based on memory. So for example, something that's going to change is the mode or like the phase that we're in, how much time is left, what is the number of sessions that were completed, and then also what interval are we in. So for example, if it's not null, that means that we're actually running, but if it's null, that means that we're actually starting up the Pomodoro timer. Next, there are certain places where we actually wanted to grab some of our HTML elements. So that's what we are referring to by that get element by ID. It's basically telling the computer to be like, okay, find this thing and hand me a handle to it so that I can actually perform some sort of function with it. But it's really just saying like, hey, go find this for me. So as an example, some of those is the time display, the mode label, the garden, the start button, pause button, and reset button. I also just like had fun doing this in Figma. The next thing that I wrote out was the recipe book. So these are actually just going to be functions that are defined, but they're like sleeping. They're like literally they're sleeping until something calls them. So I wanted to write out exactly what's happening in each of these functions and why. So we're going to have a function that's called update display that's going to turn those 1400 seconds into 24 minutes and 59 seconds left. And when you divide by 60 for minutes, the remainder is seconds. Again, this part is something that I had Claude help me with because I knew that there was like some sort of division that needed to happen, but it's good to have an AI just check to make sure that you're not really off. And I was just toying around. Figuring out exactly how many functions that I actually wanted to have. The next one, I knew that I wanted to create a function that was called plant flower. So basically creates a new picture. So this is basically taking one of the 3 images at random and it's just going to attach to the garden when a focus session is completed. We're also going to have another function that basically runs the next mode. So basically after each focus session, it adds 1 to the tally. So that's what is denoted by the ++. And after that tally, it plants a flower and then it moves on to the next mode. And it also takes into account, okay, like every 4th session, we are actually going to give the user a long break rather than a short break. And that's how we're going to denote, okay, like which mode are we in. The next one is just going to be a simple tick function. So every single second, it's basically going to subtract 1 from the number and it's going to refresh the clock. And then once the clock hits 0, it's actually going to hand off that clock to the next mode. So that was the next one that we were doing. And then next, we actually just have some controls for each one of our functions for like the start, pause, and reset timer. So on our start timer, we're going to begin ticking every second unless it's already running. For our pause timer, we're basically going to cancel the ticking. And for the reset timer, we're going to stop and go back to a fresh 25-minute session. Thing that we also had to do was just be able to wire the actual buttons to the function that was actually being performed. So that's what I mean by like start and then start timer. So basically when the start button in the HTML file is pushed, the start timer function actually runs. And then there's also a function that runs that actually updates the display. So again, all of this is just stuff in the back end, but I think it's pretty cool to understand it and then to visually just draw it out like, okay, what is actually happening and why. was ready, I started to write out my code. I tried to do most of this just with like a frame of reference, but Claude was a really great tool to actually help and verify, okay, like how do I actually encode this into my HTML file? And you can see that a lot of the functions that we have called out use those different statements that we wrote out in our Figma board. So for example, we have a starting point for a lot of our code. For example, we start in a focus mode, but then we call certain functions, and as the user performs different actions, those different variables update and actually change what is shown in the application. As I was doing this for myself, I was also writing like different little mental models. Like for example, I wanted to be able to see, okay, here are the actual like flowers that can get planted, here's the current state of the application, here's how we're actually going to grab the HTML elements that we need, and then how are we actually going to execute all of these functions. So focusing on, okay, how does this update display actually work depending on where we are in our application. And then I actually monitored it, so I wanted to make sure that when the focus time actually ended, it would plant a flower, because that's the whole point of this. And you can see that the application is doing exactly that. And finally, I knew that I wanted to just publish this on GitHub just to show you guys me kind of doing it for the first time on a non-work computer. And I thought it was pretty cool. It's pretty easy just to make sure that I had a public GitHub. I wrote out my repository name, a brief description, and then chose the visibility of like who could actually see it, and wrote out like, okay, I'm just using like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and it's going to load on a local website. So I actually put in and commit those pieces of code to my GitHub. Finally, I used a tool called Vercel to actually host a really simple version of this application so that you guys can go take a look at it. It's just called rosie-v0.vercel.app, and that's it. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know what you want to see in the next one. Bye!